Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's Bad Idea is brought to you by Alor20A6, our featured patron for the week.
You can be a featured patron by going to patreon.com/humanechoes.
Today, we're going to be talking about the zip to zap. And this delightful story was suggested to us by a listener named Alexander Forlarsky. Thank you, Alexander. I had never heard of this, Tony, and I was delighted to dig into it, and I'm delighted to bring you this weirdly named story.
I really do love the viewer suggestions because sometimes some of this stuff is so out of our purview that we'd never find it. And
Absolutely.
This one, from the little tiny bit I know about it, sounds awesome.
The place was North Dakota State University. The year was 1969. Spring break was coming up, but popular destinations like the beaches of Miami or California were thousands of miles away, beyond the reach of many students. So the staff of the NDSU student paper, The Spectrum, came up with a solution to this problem. They thought, you know what? You can have fun anywhere. Why not have fun somewhere nearby? Somewhere quaint, somewhere small, somewhere with a waterfront. And most importantly, somewhere with a funny name. So they looked around on their map of North Dakota and found the tiny town of Zap. And when I say tiny, I mean tiny. This place had 250 residents. There were 2 bars and 1 restaurant in the whole town.
That sounds like there's less than a dozen total public toilets.
Oh, it's not a lot, all right? But listen, it's just the staff of the Spectrum. These guys are just going to get away. It's just them and their friends. You know, maybe they'll go, maybe they'll bring their girlfriends along. It's just a small, intimate affair. They're all just going to head down to Zap. They come up with the name for this. As we've already stated, this is the Zip to Zap. They're going to have a little spring break fun down in Zap, North Dakota. They're going to get out some of their sort of college hijinks. And let's not forget that this is 1969, so there's quite a bit of hijinks even in North Dakota going on.
Yeah, and there's probably a lot of acid, a lot of random other drugs. It's gonna be a good time.
So they set up this little getaway, and it starts to spread. The idea of a trip to this tiny little town of Zap, a peaceful town out on the plains of North Dakota, nestled up against the Knife River, just sort of going there and kind of having a little blowout with a few college students and then heading back to college after the weekend was over. That was really appealing to a lot of students at North Dakota State University. And so the Zip to Zap starts to spread. More and more student groups start talking to the staff of the Spectrum saying, hey, we're interested in this too. You guys got room for a few more? And the Spectrum, you know, because these are fun-loving newspaper types, they say, sure, yeah, the more the merrier. Come on, we're going to have fun. It's the Zip to Zap, the town with the funny name. And because this swelling interest qualified as news, and the Spectrum was a student newspaper, they published the news that there was this growing interest in this excursion to Zap on the front page of the newspaper. Kevin Carvel, the Spectrum's editor, wrote, quote, located in the valley of the scenic Knife River, Zap, Zip 58580, has thrown open its arms to students. The beautiful Berg's 250 residents welcome us to their shores. Shall we say no to this truly fine gesture of Western hospitality? Of course not. On May 10th, we and students like us from all over the Midwest will flock to Zap, the Lauderdale of the North. Where do you get your suntan? Miami? No. Knife River. End quote.
At least it's got a very assertive name, the Knife River.
That would have been a better name for it if you were like the Knife River Getaway. You get a bunch of like hard-edged folks. The Zip to Zap seems a little bit more folksy and fun. I want to point out there's a couple of newspaper quotes from back in this day, and man, am I not into the way they were writing at the time. I don't know if it's just the quality of newspapers in North Dakota or if that was the style, but it's a weird style, Tony. This is not how I would write a newspaper if that was my job.
Do you have any quotes?
I just read you like a paragraph.
Well, I wanted more quotes.
We'll get to another quote. One thing I don't have a quote from, but I know happened, was that the Associated Press starts reporting on the Zip to Zap. Now, remember, originally it was just the staff of the Spectrum, the student newspaper, and then it kind of spread and like more people in the college were interested. And then there's another college in North Dakota that also kind of said, hey, we'll go and do this too and it'll be fun. And now that it's been published on the front page of the student newspaper, the AP office in Bismarck, North Dakota somehow gets their hands on this and runs a national story about the Zip to Zap, blasting out this plan to everybody in the United States in 1969.
Yeah, in this moment of history, how do you have such a slow news day that this becomes national news? You've got the Vietnam War going on, you're still in the middle of the civil rights movement. There's a lot happening at this point.
Here's my take on this. I think there was a lot of student unrest at the time, a lot of mistrust of what students might do, and this idea of students going out to have some kind of party and invading small town America was very much salient to the average newspaper buyer of 1969. Even if it wasn't that initially, that's what they assumed would happen. And once they published it nationwide, they kind of assured that that's definitely what would happen.
It's just a chicken or egg situation. They made it. It's their fault.
We'll get to that in our summary, but I do have another quote here. This is from the Bismarck Tribune from April 29th, 1969, in the weeks leading up to the Zip to Zap. The word has spread, and they're clearly worried because they write, quote, "Destiny is about to rear either its beautiful or tumultuous head, or both." I said that the writing was bad, and that's not even the end of the sentence. May 10th.
That sounds like a tweet I'd send at like 1 a.m.
It ends with kafefe. It's weird. May 10th, to project this quiet Mercer County city of 300 into national fame in a coincidence of double exposure. Thousands of collegians plan to descend upon Zap in a zip-in, zap-out frenzy of welcoming spring while shedding their winter blues. End quote. That's almost worse than the student paper quote. This is not the bad idea. This is just me saying, that's bad.
Up your game.
Up your sentence writing game. That was 2 sentences and it was excruciating. But for the people of Zap, this was not an impending wave of doom about to descend on their city. They actually saw this potential influx of students and other people as a business opportunity. They said, hey, great. Nobody was talking about Zap before. It was just us kind of out here in the middle of whatever kind of fields we have in North Dakota. And now there's going to be a bunch of people. That's an opportunity to make some money.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, it'd be so easy just to get, like, a whole bunch of cases of beer and sell it out of your driveway.
Well, they do. I don't know about selling out of their driveway, but those 2 bars and 1 restaurant that I mentioned earlier do start stocking up. They get big old stores of beer on hand. They get lots and lots of what they intended to call Zap burgers, which are just hamburgers, but they sell them in Zap. It's not really a
but
special.
Zappy.
Yes. They're gonna capitalize on this, Tony, and they're not the only ones, by the way. There's a toy from Whammo. Now, you may not know Whammo, the company, but you know their products because they make the Frisbee. All right? The real Frisbee, not the flying disc, Tony. If you want to buy a Frisbee and have it called Frisbee, you're buying it from Whammo. And the huge toy company Whammo premiered their toy, the Zip Zap, at the Zip to Zap. They actually sent a case of these things down here, and it's interesting. I looked up a YouTube video that had like 200 views that was a commercial for this thing. It was basically the only documentation I could find that it existed, but it was just this sort of cube of hard foam that would run along a string, and you would like sling it back and forth between two people. It's like playing tennis, but with this weird rubber foam thing that would slide back and forth. It actually looked kind of fun.
I'm not even finding a picture of this thing.
It's really obscure. The weird thing was, on the video with 200 views, there was 3 comments, and one of them was from a guy who was just like, they discontinued it because it hit me in the eye and I was blinded in my left eye. And I have no idea if that's the truth or not, but it does seem to have disappeared. So I'm just going to assume that random commenter was in fact telling the truth, because that's literally all the information I can find about the Whammo Zip Zap.
Sometimes you just got to believe the better story.
The party at Zip to Zap was supposed to kick off on Saturday, May 10th. But on Friday, May 9th, mobs of college students and other people who had heard about the Zip to Zap overran the town. This small town of 250 people now had 3,000 new residents, and all of them were ready to party. Things did not go well.
I can't imagine how nervous that sheriff must have been.
We'll get to the law enforcement in a minute, Tony, but first of all, I want to paint you this picture of this small town with like maybe 4 public buildings, right? And 3,000 people trying to crowd into those buildings. So imagine a diner, right? Let's say just a smallish diner, maybe a Waffle House, or I don't know if everybody has Waffle House, but a smallish restaurant, and then a couple of bars that are meant to serve a town of 250 people. And then you're going to try to fit 3,000 people into those buildings. All right. Maybe not at the same time, but even just the logistics of 3,000 people trying to buy a product, and the only place they could buy the product is at one of those 3 buildings. It's just jam-packed. Literally people wall to wall, shoulder to shoulder, smushed in up on each other. The bartender in the bar is so pushed in by the people that he can't get to his drinks. Like, everybody's there wanting beer, and the bartender can't reach the beer because of the mob of people that are just squishing in everywhere.
Sounds like somebody needs to call the fire marshal.
This is not a town with a fire marshal. This is barely a town with a mayor. And you know what else this town doesn't have? Porta potties.
This is just going to get messy.
I'm going to quote from an interview that Kevin Carvel, the original editor of the newspaper that kicked this whole thing off, said later in life. He just said, quote, "It was the days before porta potties," end quote. And that quote right there just really, it can just summon up just so many images in your mind of so many people in such a small town, and nature gonna call. And,
yep. And that quote was also far more elegant than the newspapers.
he had a lot of years to hone his style. So you have students urinating, vomiting, and dancing in the streets, or maybe just the one street, of Zap, North Dakota. It's gross and grody, and the single law enforcement official in the town, an old man who had been deputized specifically to deal with the influx of new visitors, around 8 o'clock, he sees this throng of people, and he says, "Ain't nothing I can do about this. takes off his badge, and just starts drinking with the rest of them.
I mean, that's sometimes the move.
Well, that's not the move that the mayor made. The mayor of Zap gets on the horn with the governor of North Dakota. The governor of North Dakota at this time is William Guy. And William Guy, I gotta say, I don't know anything else about him except what I'm reading in this story, but he strikes me as somebody with a pretty level head. Because he sees this situation, he knows that there's a lot of national attention on this, and so he's like, we're not going to let this get out of hand. He calls in the National Guard.
That seems like the escalation that would send things out of control. All of a sudden, a bunch of soldiers show up.
Yes and no. So he wants there to be control, right? He's like, we don't want these guys to destroy the town, which in some tellings of this story, they basically do. There's some exaggerations that happen. He wants this situation to be diffused, but he does, when he sends the National Guard, give them very specific instructions. Because the Detroit riots are still very much a hot button in people's memories, where the National Guard went in and basically went to war with the population in Detroit. And the governor of North Dakota says, we're not doing that here, okay? You are going to be courteous to these people. You are not going to use violence against them. You are not going to swear at them. All right? You will use the force that you need to sort of make things happen, but be cool. Do not make this a thing any more than it already is. So it's handled pretty well on the sort of government official / National Guard side of things. But before the National Guard can reach Zap, night falls on the town, and because it's North Dakota, temperatures drop to below freezing. And everybody is just now standing in the street with their beers in their hands, shivering and saying, what do we do? Well, it turns out that there was a recently demolished building that had just sort of had the rubble left in the lot where it was demolished, and they just drag all of this rubble into the middle of the street and set it on fire.
So we got Burning Man of North Dakota happening.
Yes. Now, I am sad to report some tellings of this story say that they pulled a building down to set it on fire. This was not the case as far as my research indicated. It's a great fun, like, if you wanted this story to be better, you could in fact say that they pulled a building down, but that doesn't appear to be the truth.
Yeah, get it all like hyperbolic and everything. Be like, they pulled a 3-year-old out of their cradle, ripped the house down, burned the cradle, and made a party out of it.
So you'll remember all of this is Friday afternoon going into Friday evening. The festivities aren't even scheduled to start until Saturday. But again, the mayor being on point here and seeing how badly things are getting out of hand, he goes to these people after, I assume he was on the phone with the governor, and says, listen, guys, this is a little bit too much. We'd really like you to leave. And to their credit, a lot of people do leave. Many of these people, by the time the morning gets around, have left Zap. They've said, okay, fine, it got out of hand. We'll go home. I like to think that these are probably mostly the original college students that wanted to do this just as a fun getaway in the first place. And all the people who sort of jumped on the bandwagon from outside, further out in the country, that they're maybe the ones who are sticking around, a little bit more of the agitator sort of hippie type. But I don't have demographic evidence for that at all. So that's just my internal story, Tony. You can take it or leave it.
These would be the people like me that after like 12 hours of being in a very heavily populated area with a lot of people drinking, I would just be like, I want to go home. I've had a good time and I'm done.
It is 300 or 400 miles to home, but that's better than, I guess, a few thousand miles or getting thrown in jail. And so on Saturday morning, by the time the National Guard shows up, there's about 1,000 people remaining. And for the most part, at this point, once the National Guard is there, there's like a couple of guys that try to get in fights with them. But really, it's pretty peaceful. They're able to disperse most of the college students. There's one exception, and I wasn't able to find a lot of sources for this, but apparently, in this interview that I listened to with Kevin Carvel, somebody called in who was from the town and mentioned that at the time, there was a Zap resident named August Little Soldier who had rented out his front yard to people to camp. And when the National Guard showed up, he's like, "You guys got a warrant to come on my property?" And they were like, "No." And he's like, "Well, then turn around and go harass some other people." So he sort of protected the guys that were with him, but most of the people just sort of got the message and left. Unfortunately, they didn't just go home. There's sort of this now roving band of zip to zap people who are still looking for a party to go to. And the popular rock and roll radio station of the time starts coordinating where these people are going to go next. They report that all of the Zap attendees are now moving to a new town. And what they're really doing is saying, "Hey, Zap attendees, why don't you all go to this town?" Like, nobody had been there yet. They're essentially manufacturing the crowd moving from place to place. And the great little bit of detail that I thought tied in with one of our previous episodes, Tony, the name of this radio station, the call sign for this rock and roll station that is organizing this festival that has gone horribly wrong, is KFYR.
Get that Fire Festival action in.
It's 1969 Fire Festival. Like, it's just a stupid coincidence, I realized, but when I saw that, I was like, "Whoa! I got chills! I got chills!" They're predicting it even back then.
This one sounds like a lot less embezzlement, though.
Yes, these guys are just sort of trolling.
Yes.
Radio was the 4chan of 1969. I mentioned earlier that Governor Guy is a pretty good guy in my book in this story, and he makes another move here that I think is pretty smart, because he comes out and officially announces that the people who want to continue this sort of festival journey that they're on, that they can come to the city park in Bismarck, and there'll be music there, and they can all sort of hang out and have their party, and essentially uses that to diffuse this roving band of disappointed partygoers. Because there were a bunch of other small towns that, one town in particular, heard that all these guys were coming, heard that this Zap mob was on their way, and went to the hardware store and cleaned out the shovel handle selection, and like went and stood at the border with their shovel handles and said, "Nuh-uh, you guys ain't coming in here, boys. Turn around."
That is quite the reaction. I really do think you're right about this governor, though. Like, that's a guy that's actually pretty quickly decisive on how to fix things and make it so it's not a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, it gets a lot of coverage, and that's what we're going to move into in a minute. But I think it could have gone so much worse than it did, right? It's obviously a failure on a lot of fronts, but nobody dies. Nobody is seriously hurt. It doesn't end up in like a massive clash between the National Guard and the partiers, and all of that stuff could have easily happened. I don't want to give him 100% of the credit, but you gotta at least say that somebody was on the ball and looked at what could happen and tried to mitigate the negatives, and I think that he does a great job of that in this exact instance.
Yeah, considering the track record for the 60s and National Guard people showing up, I think they did a good job. This isn't Little Rock or anything like that.
In the end, the Zip to Zap caused more than $25,000 of damage to the small town, which was eventually paid for by the North Dakota State University student government. It was also the lead story that night on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, and it really highlighted, as I mentioned earlier, the tension in the country, and I think the fact that it happened in North Dakota was a big part of why it captured everybody's imagination. Because if you're in the 60s, you could say, okay, riots in Detroit, that's the big city, right? Like, urban area, lots of people packed in there, probably some racism happening because a lot of those people are black. So they're like, that's other people. And, you know, the student protests at UCLA, those are all a bunch of weird hippies and fruits and nuts over there in California. We're not really like them. But
yeah, this is like Bible Belt area.
Well, the Bible Belt's sort of much lower, but it's definitely rural, conservative, typical farmland type North Dakota, right? I mean, it's the college still, right? Like, it's still got that 1969 college buzz going on, but it's not in an area where you can just brush it off as something that's happening to other people. And so this story, I think, at the moment really took over the national consciousness, and in a sense, it was completely manufactured by the news that ended up reporting it, right? Like, this would have gone almost nowhere if the AP hadn't published a national story about some, you know, dumb students in North Dakota State University trying to go have a party.
Yeah, it would have been like, what, like 300 to 500 people instead of 3,000?
Probably. So you capitalize on people's fears that the country is going to hell in a handbasket, and then turn it into an actual incident because of your capitalization, which you can then feed back into the country's fears that everything is going to hell in a handbasket.
I feel like the past 2 weeks we've covered some negativity about the media.
Now, I mentioned Kevin Carvel a couple of times, the editor of the student newspaper, and interestingly enough, he had dropped out of editing the paper and even from school before this event actually happened. His resignation from the paper was published on May 10th, the same day that the Zip to Zap was supposed to be kicking off, and even previous to that, he had stepped down from the paper and even dropped out of school because he said he was working so hard on the student paper that he essentially hadn't gone to class in 2 months. So he thought maybe it was time for him to take a break. There's probably also some political backlash. Again, you have that, you know, student agitator versus old guard administrator thing going on with the student paper that probably contributed some of the stuff to this, but I don't want to paint him in a horrible light. I think he's just a guy who had a silly idea, who thought, hey, we're going to go have a party, and it spiraled out of his control, and he did not take into account how badly things might go.
Yeah, and honestly, it wasn't even the worst idea. It's a cool thing to do, like, for a spring break. Just go take over a little town and all that. So, he doesn't seem like he's to blame that much for this.
Yes, it wasn't malicious. It had never been his intent to cause this kind of chaos, and it really got out of his control before he could have done much about it anyway. You could argue he shouldn't have been publishing stories about it in the student paper, but, I mean, what else are you going to publish in the North Dakota Student University paper? Like, obviously this was news for him, and so he thought, hey, we're making this thing happen, it'll be fun, and it just blew up.
Honestly, if he didn't go back to school for event planning, he's kind of doing it wrong.
It is fun to think that he talked about a lot of people who were at this party ended up going into, like, the state legislature, which I guess is not that surprising if you had thousands of students from the college in North Dakota. Like, some of them probably would have ended up in the state legislature anyway, but this was future America. They would be running the show in the 70s and 80s, and they were the ones who took over a town and caused a ruckus that almost got forgotten because of the following chaos that happens later in 1969, right? Like, there's Woodstock that kicks off, and that's just massive, and it dwarfs this as far as cultural impact and attendance and everything. So the Zip to Zap essentially gets overshadowed by many, many other big news stories, but it's really a interesting slice of the time of how things were in 1969. And I think it's a story worth remembering. And it's a story, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that has direct ramifications for today about how that sometimes news makes news, that you can create a situation just by reporting on it. And that's not to say that the newspaper shouldn't report on things, but I think people, obviously, I'm not saying that, but I do think that there should be, if you are a journalist, the sense that you have a certain amount of power and the sense that you need to wield that power responsibly.
Yeah, sometimes a story is just a small story. It doesn't need national attention.
Yep. Anyway, that is the bad idea we have for this week. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you again to Alexander Filarski for sending this in. If you guys have bad ideas that you would like us to cover, you can, if you're watching the YouTube video of this podcast, you can leave a comment. You can also send them to badideasshow@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can go over to patreon.com/humanechoes and help keep the wheels turning. And we will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.